Aaron was a young man whose life had been shaped by hardship and responsibility from an early age. He worked as an electrician, carrying around a small, worn-out toolbox that contained everything he owned to earn a living. Each morning he would set out on foot or by bus to find work fixing wires, repairing ceiling fans and replacing light bulbs. His income was hardly enough to cover the essentials of life. He rented a single room in a crowded neighborhood, where walls were thin and nights were filled with the noise of the city. Yet despite living in poverty, Aaron carried a quiet dignity within him. He never complained about his struggles. Instead, he believed that every small job he did mattered, that every switch he repaired or bulb he fixed was a way to bring light into someone's home and perhaps a little hope into their lives. His life was a reflection of patience and resilience. While many of his age sought comfort and luxury, Aaron's reality was one of sacrifice. He had dreams too, but they remained locked away in the corners of his mind, because survival was his first priority. His clothes were simple, often patched and worn, but always neat. His hands bore marks of labor, tiny cuts, rough skin and calluses, that told the story of endless hours of work. Despite all this, he had a smile that appeared easily, a kindness that people noticed when he entered their homes. He was not just fixing electrical issues, he was also showing people that even a poor man could serve with honesty, and that gave him pride in his work. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the city and the streets began to glow with artificial lights, Aaron was preparing to head back home after a long day. His body ached from climbing ladders and bending over wires, but before he could put his tools away, his phone rang. The voice on the other side belonged to a servant who said they needed his help immediately at a certain address. When the servant gave the details, Aaron paused. The address was not just any street but one of the wealthiest areas of the city, known for its lavish houses and residents who lived in unimaginable luxury. He hesitated. In his mind, doubts arose. Why would such people call a poor electrician like him? Would they even treat him with respect? For a moment he thought of declining, but then he reminded himself that work was work, and it didn't matter where it came from. So, with determination, he picked up his tools once again and began the journey toward the mansion. When he reached the gates, his heart raced. The mansion was massive, guarded by tall gates and watchmen. Chandeliers glittered inside, and the glow from the windows seemed like something from another world. Aaron, with his plain clothes and dusty shoes, felt out of place. The servant at the door gave him a curious glance but then allowed him inside. With each step, Aaron's eyes wandered across the marble floors, the luxurious furniture, and the paintings that seemed worth more than everything he had ever owned in his life. For a man who counted every coin before buying a loaf of bread, such wealth was overwhelming, but he forced himself to stay calm, reminding himself that he was there for a purpose. The servant led him to one of the rooms where the problem was a bulb had stopped working. A bulb of all things, Aaron almost smiled at the thought. In a mansion that looked like it could buy 100 new chandeliers, they had called him for a simple bulb replacement. But he didn't question it. Work was work, and his pride was in doing it well. He opened his box, took out the tools and began preparing to climb the ladder that had been placed near the wall. As he reached for the bulb, his thoughts were simple. He was focused, just as he always was. He did not think about who lived there or what wealth surrounded him. His only concern was completing the task with honesty and precision. It was in that quiet moment, when he was about to climb the ladder, that his life unknowingly shifted course. He was still the poor electrician with rough hands and a tired body, but destiny had decided that even the smallest of actions, a man replacing a bulb in a mansion, could open the door to something much greater than he had ever imagined. The job seemed small, almost meaningless compared to the grandeur around him, yet it was about to connect two worlds, one of wealth and luxury, and the other of humility and struggle. Aaron didn't know it yet, but his simple act of work was going to touch someone's heart in a way that money never could. When Aaron stepped further into the grand mansion, he felt as though he had crossed into another world, a world that seemed almost unreal to a man like him. The polished marble floors reflected the glow of golden chandeliers that hung high above, sparkling like captured stars. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfumes, the kind he had never even seen in shops he passed on his way home. He walked slowly, careful not to leave marks on the spotless surface with his worn shoes. His heart was pounding in his chest, not from fear but from the overwhelming difference between the life he lived and the life that was displayed all around him. To him it was like entering a palace, and yet he reminded himself over and over again that he was here not as a guest but as a worker. The servant guided him through long hallways adorned with portraits of ancestors, each painting framed in gold. There were tall windows covered with velvet curtains, and furniture so fine that Aaron didn't dare look at it too long. Every step he took made him more conscious of his plain clothes and the toolbox in his hand. He felt small, but he carried himself with humility and respect. Finally they reached the room where the problem had occurred. It was a living room so large it could have been mistaken for a hall. The ceiling stretched high and the walls were decorated with art that told stories of wealth and heritage. And in the center of the room, ironically, the only thing that seemed out of place was a single bulb that had stopped working. Orman quietly set down his box and began to take out the tools he needed. Just as he was about to climb the ladder, the door opened gently and in walked someone who made him pause. It was Ashe, the daughter of the millionaire who owned the house. She looked no older than Orman himself, yet everything about her spoke of grace and privilege. She wore an elegant dress, simple yet costly, and her presence seemed to fill the room. Orman lowered his gaze immediately out of respect, for he had never been the type to stare or act arrogantly. He greeted her softly, "Assalamu alaikum," his voice steady yet humble. Asha looked at him with curiosity. She had seen countless workers come and go in her home, most of whom carried themselves nervously or tried too hard to impress. But there was something different about this young man. He seemed grounded, uninterested in the wealth that surrounded him, focused only on the task at hand. She gave him a polite nod, and for a moment, silence filled the room, except for the faint ticking of a grand clock on the wall. Orman climbed the ladder carefully, holding the bulb that would replace the broken one. His movements were practiced, efficient and without hesitation. This was not the first time he had done such work. Yet here, in this mansion, the act carried a different weight. He could feel Ayesha's eyes on him, not in judgment, but in quiet observation. His hands worked steadily, though they bore small cuts and calluses that spoke of years of labor. To Ayesha, who had grown up in comfort, those hands seemed to carry a story of survival and honesty. As he unscrewed the broken bulb and fixed the new one in place, Orman's mind was not on impressing anyone but simply on doing his job well. He knew that for people living in such luxury, a single bulb might mean nothing, but for him, every task carried importance. He believed that no work was small if it was done sincerely. When he twisted the new bulb into place and the light suddenly filled the room, a glow spread across the walls, making everything shine brighter. The brightness was ordinary, but in that moment it felt like a silent victory for Orman, a man who gave his best even in the simplest of tasks. Ayesha smiled slightly as the light spread across the room. "Thank you," she said softly, her tone polite but touched with something more. To her it was not just the light returning to the room, but the quiet dedication of the man who had made it happen. Orman climbed down from the ladder, gathering his tools with the same calm humility he had shown throughout. He did not expect praise, nor did he linger for attention. For him the job was complete, and that was enough. But in Alicia's heart, a seed had been planted. She had witnessed countless gestures of wealth and extravagance in her life, but seldom had she seen such quiet dignity in someone so poor. She noticed how he never complained, never boasted, and never demanded more than his due. He had walked into her herd of abundance without asking for anything except the chance to serve honestly. In that simple moment of changing a bulb, he had unknowingly drawn her attention, not with wealth, not with words, but with sincerity. For Orman it was just another day of work. For Ayesha, it was the beginning of something she couldn't yet define. Orman's hands worked with practiced precision as he packed his tools back into the old wooden box. The light he had just fixed now spread warmth across the room, chasing away the dull shadows that had lingered moments before. For him it was a simple task, one he had done countless times in cramped homes and dark shops across the city. Yet here inside a mansion that gleamed with wealth, that same act seemed strangely symbolic. He had stepped into a world where everything sparkled, where nothing seemed out of reach, and still, all it took to restore brightness was a poor man with rough hands and a humble heart. Asha, standing silently at the edge of the room, observed him closely. She had expected the electrician to be like many others she had seen, either intimidated by the grandeur of the house, or eager to impress its wealthy owners. But Orman was different. His eyes never wandered around the mansion in awe or greed. He did not marvel at the expensive paintings or the shimmering chandelier overhead. Instead he was calm, focused and entirely devoted to finishing his work. That quiet dedication stirred something in her. When Orman bent down to lock his toolbox, Ayesha's eyes fell on his hands. They were not like the polished, manicured hands of the men she met at parties or gatherings. These hands were worn, scarred with tiny cuts, and darkened by labor. Each line etched into his skin seemed like proof of years of struggle. For the first time in her privileged life, Ayesha found herself wondering what kind of life those hands had lived, what kind of sacrifices they had made just to earn a modest meal at the end of the day. She realized there was a story behind those hands, one of persistence and silent courage. Orman stood up straight and said politely, "The bulb is working now, madam." His voice was low, respectful, without the slightest attempt to show off. Alicia nodded, still caught up in her thoughts, before she finally managed a small smile. "You didn't just fix a bulb," she said softly, almost as if she was speaking to herself. "You brought light into this room." Her words lingered in the air, delicate yet powerful. Arman paused for a moment, surprised, for replying with quiet sincerity. "It's my job, madam, but sometimes even a little light can remove a lot of darkness." His tone carried no weight of arrogance, only the truth of a man who had lived through shadows of his own. Those words struck Ayesha deeply. She had heard countless speeches from successful businessmen and influential leaders in her social circle, yet none had touched her heart the way this poor electrician's simple sentence did. She realized that wisdom often came not from books or money, but from people who had lived through struggle and hardship. Arman, however, did not notice the impact of his words. To him it was nothing more than a thought he had carried with him for years, a truth he had learned while working under dim streetlights and in homes where families could barely afford electricity. He did not realize that in that very moment he had unknowingly drawn a bridge between two worlds, his world of survival and hers of abundance. Ayesha looked at him differently now. In her eyes he was not just a worker fixing a bulb but a man who carried dignity even in poverty. She felt a strange warmth rising in her chest, a feeling she had not experienced before. She wondered how someone who had so little could carry himself with such grace, while she, despite having everything, often felt an emptiness inside. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, where words were unnecessary. Arman picked up his toolbox and prepared to leave, but Alicia's gaze lingered on him, as if she wanted to hold on to that moment a little longer. For her, the bulb glowing in the room was not just a source of light anymore. It had become a symbol of humility, of sincerity, and of the quiet strength of a man who asked for nothing yet gave more than he realized. That night, as she walked through the mansion's endless halls, her thoughts kept returning to the poor electrician. She didn't know why, but something about him had settled deep within her heart. What had started as a simple repair job had become the beginning of something neither of them could fully understand. For Arman, it was just another day's work. For Ayesha, it was the first spark of a feeling she had never known before. Days turned into weeks, and though Arman had left the mansion that evening without expecting anything more, the memory of his quiet sincerity remained with Ayesha. She found herself thinking about him at odd times, during grand dinners where guests laughed too loudly, at charity events where smiles were polished but hollow, and in the silence of her own room where wealth surrounded her but failed to give her peace. His words echoed in her mind. Sometimes even a little light can remove a lot of darkness. They were simple, yet they carried a depth she had never experienced from the men in her social circle. Ayesha began finding small reasons to call for Arman again. A loose wire in the kitchen, a faulty switch in the corridor, or even just a dimming bulb in the guest room. Tasks so small that in truth any servant could have managed them. Yet she insisted that Arman be called. Each time he came, he carried the same modest toolbox, wore the same simple clothes, and carried the same calm expression. He never asked unnecessary questions, never lingered longer than needed, and never behaved in a way that betrayed arrogance. But in those short visits, Ayesha began to notice more. She noticed the way he spoke with respect to the servants, the way he carefully measured every step to avoid damaging anything in the house, and the way his tired eyes still carried a light that no luxury could buy. Their conversation started small. At first it was no more than polite greetings and short exchanges about the repairs, but slowly Ayesha found herself asking about his life. Arman was hesitant at first, but his honesty could not be hidden for long. He told her how he had lost his father at a young age, and had become the only support for his mother and younger siblings. He shared how he had left school to earn, giving up his dreams so his family would not go hungry. He spoke without complaint, almost as if sacrifice was simply a normal part of life. Ayesha listened in silence, her heart softening with every word. She realized that beneath his poverty was a richness of character that was rare in the world she knew. One afternoon, after fixing yet another small issue, Arman was preparing to leave when Ayesha suddenly spoke. Her voice quiet but firm. "You came here to change a bulb, but you ended up changing my heart." The words surprised even her as they escaped her lips, but she meant them with all her being. Arman froze, unsure of how to respond. He was a poor electrician after all, and she was the daughter of a millionaire. The worlds they belonged to were not meant to cross, yet in that moment all the boundaries of wealth and status seemed to vanish. Arman bowed his head and said softly, "Madam, I am only a worker. I have nothing to offer but honesty and hard work." His humility made Ayesha's eyes sting with unshed tears. She shook her head gently and replied, "Sometimes honesty and hard work are worth more than all the wealth in the world." From that day onward, their bond grew stronger. Ayesha found herself admiring not just his words, but the life he had lived. She had known men who drove expensive cars and wore suits worth thousands, yet none had the strength of character that Arman carried in his tired hands and humble eyes. She began to realize that true wealth was not in mansions, gold or luxury, but in the purity of the heart. Arman too found himself drawn to her kindness. Though he tried to resist the feelings that began to bloom in his heart, he could not ignore the gentleness with which she treated him. Unlike anyone else from her world, in her he saw not a millionaire's daughter but a woman who longed for sincerity, someone who valued him for who he was rather than what he owned. Their story did not unfold with dramatic declarations or lavish displays of love. It grew quietly, like a flame sheltered from the wind, steady and enduring, and in time it became clear to both of them that their hearts had found something rare, a connection that wealth could never buy and poverty could never diminish. The day came when Ayesha stood before her family and said with unwavering courage, "This is the man I choose. Not for his money, for he has none. Not for his status, for the world would call him poor, but for his honesty, his kindness, and the light he brought into my life when I did not even realize I was living in darkness." And though the path ahead was not easy, one truth remained unshakable. The poor electrician who had once been called to replace a single bulb had ended up igniting a love so pure that even the richest hearts could not compete with it. For Armin and Ayesha, it was proof that true wealth lies not in the abundance of possessions but in the sincerity of the soul.